I have long thought about whether to tell this story. To be honest, I never wanted to return to these memories. Many years have passed, but these horrors still echo in my dreams. Yet now, after enough time has passed, and I have something to say, the moment has come to finally share it. It all began when I decided to enroll in college in the US. It was supposed to be a new beginning, new friends, new opportunities, new knowledge. But I could never have imagined that I would encounter real nightmares within the first few days. Even before classes started, I had heard about fraternities, those mysterious student organizations that hide behind the facade of an elite club. I didn't even plan on joining, but it seemed like they had chosen me. I was invited to the first meeting at a house located off campus, an old building with aged doors and tall windows that flickered in the moonlight. The atmosphere was oppressive, and even as I approached the building, I felt a strange chill, despite the warm night. My new dorm friends convinced me it was just a tradition. Everyone goes through it. The first night was rather innocent. We were shown several rooms filled with photographs of former fraternity members. I recognized some faces, successful alumni, influential people, celebrities. At the time, it seemed exciting to belong to such an elite circle. But what followed was pure madness. We stood before an old, creaky door leading to the basement. It smelled of mildew, and the air was heavy. When the door finally opened, we were presented with a narrow staircase descending into darkness. One of the older brothers, wearing a hood, handed me a candle. "You go first," he said with a faint, unsettling smile. There was nothing funny about his words, and I immediately felt that. We descended into the basement, where the air was thick with the scent of dampness and burning wax. Down there, under the earth, it was dark, with only faint candlelight illuminating our path. When we gathered in a circle, the older brothers began whispering words I couldn't understand, but I felt them seep deep into my veins like poison. It was unreal. I started to feel like I was becoming part of something evil, though if only I knew then where it would lead. The next day, we received a new task. This time, they took us to a forest located far beyond campus, away from buildings and student life. The night was pitch black, and the light of the moon barely penetrated through the dense trees. They blindfolded us and forced us to walk in a line, holding each other's hands. The other freshmen, Jake, Kyle, and Brandon, were next to me, and I could hear their breathing grow heavier. When we reached the heart of the forest, the older brothers stopped. Their voices were soft, almost inaudible, but I understood this was another test. We were told to run. Run in different directions and find something we didn't know. "Anyone who doesn't find it by dawn will not return," one of the brothers said. And at that moment, we all realized this was no joke. I ran, not knowing where, not knowing what I was supposed to find. The forest seemed endless, and with each step, my heart beat faster. In the darkness, I heard the screams of the other freshmen. One of them cried out in pain, and that's when I realized we weren't alone in the forest. I stumbled upon a small, round amulet embedded in the ground. I picked it up and heard the voice of the older brother. "You've passed. Come back." But the others, not all of them returned that night. Jake disappeared. We never saw him again. On the third night, they brought us back to that same basement, which I had already begun to hate. Now the walls seemed even narrower, and the air even heavier. The older brothers ordered us to spend the night in the basement, without candles or light. "This is a test of your mind," they said. "Only the strongest will survive." The darkness was absolute. I could hear Brandon breathing beside me, his nervous breath betraying his fear. Kyle was farther away, but occasionally I could hear him moving across the floor. My eyes couldn't adjust to the darkness, It was thick, like ink. And in that darkness, I began to hear something else. Not the breaths of the freshmen, not the footsteps of the brothers, but something creeping, like a living thing, slithering across the floor. Time passed unbelievably slowly. The cold seeped into my bones, and every moment felt like an eternity. Then I heard the whisper again. At first, I thought it was Brandon, but the whisper was too soft, too foreign. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the symbols carved into the stone. The words were in a language I couldn't understand, but they filled me with growing dread. They cut through the air like a knife, calling to something dark and merciless. And then I felt it again, that same cold touch on my neck that I had felt before. It was here with us, and it was not human. I froze, not knowing what to do. It was like paralysis. The fear gripped me so tightly that I couldn't move or scream. The next day, they called us again. This time, there was a table in the basement. On the table were objects that symbolized a sacrifice. The older brothers stood silently, watching us. Their faces were emotionless, cold, as if they had been through this so many times that they no longer felt anything. "Each of you must bury your sacrifice in the forest," said Dylan, the senior brother who led the rituals. "This is an act of cleansing. It's a part of you. You can only join the fraternity after this." I looked at the objects and felt a wave of nausea. This was too much. I couldn't continue. But Jake and Brandon, the ones who were left with me, obeyed. They took the objects and silently went into the forest. Fear gripped me, and I knew I couldn't go through with it. I refused. When I refused, the room fell into an eerie silence. The older brothers stared at me with cold, empty eyes. The already oppressive air of the basement seemed to thicken even more, as if the room itself was reacting to my defiance. Dylan, the leader, stepped forward and, leaning closer to me, whispered, "No one has ever refused before. Do you know what that means?" I remained silent, unable to break eye contact. His eyes seemed almost inhuman, gleaming, cold, devoid of any emotion. He made a signal to the others, and they quickly gathered around me. Their faces were as expressionless as before, as if they were mere puppets being pulled by invisible strings. They grabbed me by the arms and dragged me deeper into the basement. I screamed, struggled, but it was in vain. In my mind, a thought echoed. This could end very badly. I realized that the boys I had seen on campus, who seemed like ordinary students, were something else entirely when they were down here, in this cursed basement. They threw me onto the cold stone floor, and I felt a sharp pain as my knees hit the hard surface. The basement was darker than usual. The candles barely flickered, and the shadows on the walls grew larger, distorted. And then I saw those symbols again. Their outlines seemed to pulsate in sync with my heartbeat, and looking at them filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. They began to whisper again. The same strange words I had heard before. But now they were louder, and it felt like the whispering was coming not just from the brothers, but from the very walls, the floor, the darkness that surrounded me. I closed my eyes trying to focus on my breathing, but I could feel the fear seeping deeper into me. "You must understand. No one leaves here unchanged," Dylan said again. "You've already gone too far to refuse now. Your decision might cost you more than you think." They ordered me to stay in the basement for the entire night, but this time without any candles or company. I was to be alone, in the dark. They left me there, and as soon as the door shut, I felt the darkness closing in on me from all sides. This was no longer just fear of the dark. It was something much worse, something far more terrifying. I tried to focus on any sounds, but all I could hear was my breathing and the pounding of my heart. Yet after a few minutes, I realized I was not alone. Something was moving in the darkness. It didn't make any noise, but I could feel its presence. It was as if something was creeping closer and closer to me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I just sat there, paralyzed by fear. And then I heard it again, the same creeping whisper. But this time it was much closer, as if right next to my ear. I couldn't understand the words, but they radiated coldness and malice. I felt the whisper seep into my mind like poison. And at that moment, I was filled with a panic so overwhelming, I could barely hold back my screams. What made it worse was that time seemed to have stopped. I couldn't tell how long I had been sitting there in the dark. Maybe it was only a few minutes, maybe hours. I just sat there, listening to the horrible whisper, feeling something invisible closing in on me. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a light appeared. The door opened, and Dylan entered, holding a flashlight. His face looked even paler than usual, and his eyes gleamed with triumph. "Congratulations," he said, walking closer. "You passed this trial, but now you must make a choice." They gathered me again with the other freshmen. Each of us looked exhausted, terrified, drained beyond measure. We didn't exchange words. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts. That night, we all understood that the fraternity was not just a club for parties and connections. It was something much more, something much darker. And now, we were a part of it. We were taken to the forest again, but this time they didn't blindfold us. The trees around us were dense and black, as if they absorbed every ray of light. This time, each of us was given the task of finding the way back. We didn't know what that meant, but we understood we had been left here for the whole night without any help. The forest seemed endless, and I could barely see my friends. We were scattered in different corners of this nightmarish space. In every shadow, I saw something that wasn't human. Sometimes I heard screams in the distance, but every time I ran towards the sound, I found no one there. The fear began to turn into panic, but I had to keep moving. I don't know how long this terrifying hunt lasted. I heard whispers, saw shadows flickering between the trees. From time to time, I felt that cold touch on my neck, the same one I had felt in the basement. It was like a reminder that I belonged to something much bigger than I could imagine. When the sun finally rose, I emerged from the forest. Dylan and the older brothers were already waiting for us at the edge, their faces expressionless. Of the entire group of freshmen, only Brandon and I returned. Kyle disappeared that night just like Jake before him. This story still haunts me. All these years I've tried to forget about the fraternity, about what we went through together as freshmen, about those trials, about Jake and Kyle, whom we never saw again. But every night in my dreams, I hear that whisper again, see those symbols on the basement walls. Maybe I will never escape this horror. Now, after many years, I have decided to tell this story. Not for sympathy or fame. I just want to warn others. Sometimes it's better to stay away, not to enter where you're not invited. Sometimes it's better not to know what lies behind the doors that are opened for you.